I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Mikita Brottman, psychoanalyst, professor, and author, here to discuss her newest book, Couple Found Slain After a Family Murder. Her other books include An Unexplained Death, The True Story of a Body at the Belvedere, The Maximum Security Book Club, Reading Literature in a Men's Prison, and Phantoms of the Clinic, From Thought Transference to Projective Identification. For more, please check out her website, MikitaBrottman.com. That's MikitaBrottman.com. You can also follow her at Mikita Brottman on Instagram and at Brottman Mikita at Twitter. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, from Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. That's VANESSA23CARL. Your support is so appreciated. Thank you so much to all of our Patreon patrons. We really appreciate your support, and it helps us keep on going. You can visit the Rendering Unconscious website at renderingunconscious.org. On the left, you'll see menus that have all of our episodes listed chronologically, as well as another that has all of our episodes listed alphabetically by author's last name. That way you can easily find your favorite topics and authors. You can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_ at Instagram and Twitter. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. As with all episodes of Rendering Unconscious podcast, there is a video of this episode up at YouTube. Just search for Trapart Films YouTube channel, that's TRAPART Film at YouTube, or search for Vanessa Sinclair Rendering Unconscious podcast. All right, so as I said, I'm ready to get into it with you. I love this book.
Great, let's get into it.
Couple Found Slain. I love how you started the book, and how I remember when I came down to Baltimore and you were talking about this reading group that you were doing at the prison. And I love how that's how you came in contact with this man and now have this like entire book about this story. So what would you like to discuss about it first?
I think the way that it starts is with the crime, and there were like a lot of previous iterations of this book. Like I went through many versions before the final version, and like it's partly kind of the editor who wanted the crime at the forefront, because there is a market for true crime, and it is kind of partly a true crime book. I'm partly interested in true crime, but Brian himself didn't like that. He liked earlier versions of the book because he didn't really want to have so much focus on the crime, which is kind of understandable because it's 27 years ago. He really wants to not focus on that and focus more on, like, he wanted it to be more about his ordeal, his kind of life in purgatory, which it is actually. It just doesn't start out that way. So yeah, it's partly true crime, but it's also partly like a kind of me telling Brian's story of being kind of stuck in this purgatory of the forensic psych ward for 27 years, and he's still there.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, because his life didn't start with the crime. There's a lot that happened before that, and then there's been a lot even longer time since where he's been stuck in this hospital.
Yeah, and most true crime is focused on the crime, and it has certain roles, like the victim and the perpetrator, and there's no gray area between those roles. It's like the victim cannot be the perpetrator, and there's no sense that actually those are kind of the same person at different points on the spectrum in their lifetime. Most perpetrators were victims to begin with, and also that most true crime ends with the justice being done, but justice for one person is not necessarily justice for everyone. And most young men who commit terrible crimes are in their early 20s, and so it's like the beginning of their life. So they live the rest of their lives in prisons or psychiatric hospitals, and they disappear from the picture. And in some ways that's appropriate because the focus is on the victim, but they go on living their lives, and they change and they develop and they get jobs and marry, and even if they're still in prison, they still live, they're still full human beings with and even lives that are constrained, as Brian's is in this book, can be full of events, interesting events.
Yeah, exactly. A lot continues to happen. They continue to have relationships with different people, like in the facility or that come into the facility from outside. And like I told you before we started recording, I really love that this is written by your point of view as a psychologist. And I hope there's a whole field of true crime written by psychologists. It's really compelling because I read a lot of like murder mystery books, and I've read Moving to Sweden. I've read like all of they have tons of them. I just go through them really quickly, but it's always like from the point of view of a detective or a policeman, like brutal kind of policeman psychology, or a journalist or something like that. And I haven't come across any by psychologists. I'm sure there must be some others, but I really love it. And I love that there's so much nuance and, like you said, focus on the fact that people that commit crimes usually are really young, in their teens or early 20s, and then it changes the course of their entire life. They usually were victims of abuse in some way, and like that, like this crime doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It's like after decades of abuse.
Yeah, and I'm interested in talking to you about the psychology and the psychology of the hospital, because it's something that we have in common, and that's something I really wanted to get into in the book, how much of a failure it is and how little is done for people in places like this. And there isn't an answer. I mean, it's not like an expose or saying this is terrible, this is what should be done, because it's just, there are so many people in this forensic system, and so so little funding that the psychiatrists are really overworked. There's so many security procedures that have to be involved that most people tend to spend their times, sitting around watching television or are just over medicated. And if Brian is typical, then many of these people could easily live productive, functional lives on the outside. It's just that there isn't a system set up to deal with them, and yet, if they had access to different kinds of therapy or psychoanalysis, I think their lives could be very different. If a different approach could be taken. but it's so hard because of the enormous amounts of, you know, the drug companies and the funding and the medications and the DSM and all that. It's just a huge mess.
No, it's so tied together in the U.S. I can speak to the U.S. system. It's like the prison system and the hospital system, and we're seeing the psychiatric system and the pharmaceutical system. And they even include the food industry in there because, like, the FDA that approves like pharmaceuticals, a lot of people like they put pharmaceuticals in the animals that we eat, cows and things like that. And it's like all it's all a huge racket.
Yeah. And also like the credentialing and the DSM and the diagnostic system and like who's allowed to make diagnoses and what those diagnoses imply and like how they continue for the rest of your life. You can never overcome them, and the training of psychiatry. I mean, all of that is tied in there too. And if you trace it back, none of these things were started out badly or corrupt. It's just over time that, you know, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more money gets involved, and things accrue.
Yeah, and like in medical school, like psychiatrists are taught this is the correct way to treat people. Like I have a friend, Todd Dean, who was on an early podcast episode, who's a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst. And that's where he talked about like having to work through, because when you're trained, you listen to the authority, they teach you this is the right thing to do. You work by the DSM, you give these people these medications for these conditions, just like as if they were like physical medical conditions. You know, they're treating them just like this is a brain anomaly or chemical imbalance that you treat with these medications. And as young, they're also young and trained to do this. And then that's just the way they see or are taught that that's the correct ethical way to work. So he had to like work through all of that kind of indoctrination before he came to more psychoanalytic understanding of people.
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I remember when I was in training, they put real emphasis on diagnosis right very, very early. Mm-hmm. Even in analytic training. And I remember having a patient who I can't remember what I diagnosed her with, but I was told that I'd missed something very important, which was the fact that she hadn't shaved her legs, and that was a sign that she'd like given up trying to attract men. Like, so I failed because I didn't make a note of that, and I didn't include that, and like that was a pathology that I should have noticed. I mean, it's so old-fashioned and archaic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember a supervisor asking me if my patient had her nails painted or not, or if it was like chipping or like not painted. And I was like, I have no idea. I don't look at people's nails like that.
I know. Sometimes chipped nails and ripped jeans are like the height of fashion. I mean, it could be very, very deliberate.
And I also really love this point, though, that he was specifically, we haven't even talked about it. His crime was, though, that he did murder his parents.
Yeah.
And actually, Manya Steinkola, in our book on violence and psychoanalysis, she wrote a paper about Adam Lanza, who killed all those little, like, kindergartners in Sandy Hook, and how he also killed his mother first. And, you know, she wrote a kind of psychoanalytic understanding of all the abuse that kind of happened in that household and like the mentality of the parents and how he had been taken to treatment a lot of times, but like for some reason it wasn't really taken that seriously. And his mom insisted on homeschooling him. So it was like he was like trapped in this like bubble with his mother. And like it seemed to her like he couldn't get out except for to like annihilate her and himself and like the world around him. Which could be like a psychotic process, but again, like could be understood because of course, like in the media, there's never gonna be a point of view of like why did this kid who's also a young person do this, you know, horrific act.
And when they bring, like in those cases, whenever they bring a psychiatrist in, there's so much opprobrium on the part of the public and the media, like, oh, you're going to attribute it all to his mother and his upbringing, and this is just coddling him and trying to get him out of prison. And there's a, you know, psychiatrists, when it comes to crime, have such a bad rap in the public that like to consider the psychology of any criminal is seen as soft-hearted and irrelevant. And in fact, the killing of one's parents, parricide, used to be known as the schizophrenic crime, because among the schizophrenics who commit crime, and more schizophrenics are victims of crime than commit crime, but when they do commit crimes, killing the parents is not unusual. When I was working on this book, I was in touch with this Professor Kathleen Hyder, who did one of the blurbs, and she's written a book called Understanding Parasite, when sons and daughters kill parents, and she studied a lot of kids who kill their parents, and it's usually, the same. It's like after decades of abuse, the kid is usually acting on the kind of unspoken wishes of the rest of the siblings or of the surviving parent. They're acting out some kind of unspoken force that's been going on for a very long time. That, it's almost like they become a vehicle for the family itself. The way that one child sometimes acts out the parent's wishes, and the difference between a schizophrenic parasite and an ordinary parasite like the Menendez murders is usually that there's no trigger. There doesn't seem to be a trigger. The parent is killed when they're going about their everyday business. It's not something happens. It's like in this case, Brian's parent, he got up in the morning and his father was making breakfast and his mother was watching television, and it was just, there was an internal trigger, and it was the climax for Brian of decades of, years and years of mental illness. So in his case, there's no question that he was mentally ill and had been for a long time. And yet, before he killed his parents, there was a situation where he was walking around the house with a loaded gun, taking it into the shower with him. You have to ask, what were the parents thinking? But I think that kind of neglect had gone on for a really long time. And, it's interesting how the family becomes, the hospital becomes another system, like the family, another of these sort of dysfunctional systems where things that an outsider would immediately see, oh my God, you're letting that happen? How can that happen? But if you're in the system, you're so used to it that you just don't see it. So I think it probably goes on in most families. What goes on in the privacy of the home can be so dysfunctional to an outsider that you just take it for granted. People live in all kinds of different conditions because it's just part of the system, and you get so used to it. So as an outsider in the hospital, that perspective, I could see where things were just really messed up and dysfunctional. But I think to people who work there, and even the patients themselves, they were so used to it that they often didn't see these the same with prisons or any institution. When you go in there as an outsider, you see things that people who take it for granted just don't see.
Yeah, and like you described, people are mostly just watching this television that's in a cage, and they're over medicated, and they don't really have any activities that they can do, and they're just it feels like kind of like living zombies.
Yeah.
And especially that's a good thing to point out as well, is he was declared criminally insane, or whatever they call it now, not suitable for court or whatever. And so he ended up in a hospital, but then he goes through a whole issue where there's no sentence. There was never sentence to this many years, so there's no end point. So it's just this endless kind of treatment or hospital stay that doesn't really have any course of treatment or an end in sight.
Yeah, and so it's a real we say that in Maryland, at least, it's not criminal or responsible is the new not guilty by reason of insanity. So we're saying that someone is not responsible for their crime. In this case, Brian killed his parents, but we're saying that because of an illness, he's not responsible. And there's a big fuss made about taking mental illness as seriously as physical illness, which quite rightly it should be, and we should get the same kind of insurance coverage and everything. But then if we're going to say that someone, if someone had, Alzheimer's and killed someone, or had a seizure and killed someone, we wouldn't send them to prison. We wouldn't see them as responsible. But people in Brian's situation, where they have committed a murder but are seen as not responsible because of their mental state, are in this kind of limbo where people feel like there is a sense that they have to be punished somehow. Like in the John Hinckley case, for example, he was released recently, but I think people think, like, oh, you go to a hospital and that's it, you don't come out because you've done something that's really terrible. But what is the hospital for if not to treat people and to get them better and release them? So these are not hospitals in the ordinary sense. They're more like warehouses or holding facilities. And I think, asylum would be a better word. We don't really use that word anymore, but there's no sense that, like, you're being treated on a daily basis, and you have the rights and privileges of a hospital patient. So it's this strange limbo between prison and hospital that's sort of a bit of both and neither. And people often think that it's better to be found, to be sent to a forensic hospital than to go to prison. And maybe it is in many cases, but in Brian's case, for him and others in the hospital who'd experienced prison, told me that they'd much rather be in prison. And in fact, sometimes, including Brian's, they would commit crimes to try and be sent to prison, because, for various reasons. One is that if you have a prison sentence, even if it's life without parole, it's like, there isn't that torture of hope where you think, if I behave this way for this psychiatrist, if I take these medications, like, there's this endlessly delayed hope of release, which at least in prison, if you know that you're there for life, you can relax and behave as you would normally behave. You don't have to keep jumping through these hoops and obeying rules. But if you had a limited sentence, even if it was 30 or 40 years, there's an end in sight. Whereas in the hospital, for many patients, there isn't an end in sight. And a couple of the patients who committed crimes to get sent to prison told me that the other thing about prison is that you have a certain dignity. Like, one of the problems with the hospital is, like, they're judging you all the time. So if you don't come to breakfast, or if you don't want to exercise, that's kind of noted in your file and it's seen as symptomatic, and you're not sure whether it's being held against you or not. Whereas in prison, you're like anyone else. You're a moral being with your own agency, and your choices are seen as human choices, and you have your own reasons for them, and it's not held against you. So it's it's really like something out of Kafka. And I was surprised that there are people who'd been in prison and then back to the hospital and back to prison, said that they preferred prison. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, but that makes sense, that, like you said, if you skip breakfast, or like people that didn't want to take their medication because they don't want to feel like a zombie, and they're being non-compliant. So it's like you basically it's like you have to do what you're told, or else you're problematic, period.
Yeah, and the medications are, that was one of the main reasons why Brian had so much trouble making any progress. In the first few years, he seemed to be doing well, and he seems to be making progress. And there's I described this in the book, an A&E documentary called Untying the Straitjacket that features Brian. He's 26 in that documentary, and he's shown as like one of the most high functioning people in the hospital, and he's kind of articulate, and he's shown exercising, and they're talking about the process of release, and it looks at that point as if he's on the way to getting out, and yet everyone else in that show has been released long ago, and Brian's still there. And it's partly because, like, he saw what medication did to people, and it made him incontinent and impotent, and every time he took it, the same happened. And there's he told me there's a period of years, like 1997 to 2000, I slept on a chair. Like, he can't remember those years because he was just medicated so heavily. And it's very difficult to see what function it has apart from keeping the hospital population quiet and calm so that there's no trouble. So it's more like a kind of punishment than anything else.
Yeah, it's just to knock them out. Because even my dad was in the hospital in the fall of 2019, just because he had a physical illness. And then he was sent to like a rehabilitation center afterwards to like get rehabilitated for a couple of weeks. And that's what I found there. They just wanted to knock them all out because my dad was acting so weird, and like I was like, what is going on with him once he got to this rehab center? And like I was like, isn't he supposed to be getting like rehab, getting better? you know? And he just seemed so strange. And I finally just like after like asking several times, I wanted to see his medication list. And they're like, oh, that doctor is not here. This is so I felt like I was totally getting the runaround. And I was like, what's going on? And they had him on Oxycontin. And I was like, he didn't have surgery or anything. They just gave it to him to like knock him out and make him sleep, you know? I was furious. So I feel like it's kind of become really common practice, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's just like knocking people on the head with a hammer to keep them quiet. And partly it's because, that there are so many patients and there's such a shortage of staff and it's really badly paid. And so it's the security staff who kind of make most of the decisions, actually, who see the patients most often. And it's a kind of low prestige, being a psychiatrist for the state is sort of a low prestige occupation when you could be making lots of money in private practice. So, but
it also seems to have a high turnaround. Like people, like the doctors came through, they didn't stay very long.
Yeah. I mean, Brian's been there much longer than most of the doctors, and I think it's just that. I mean, I've been in a psychiatric hospital myself a couple of times, and it was so useless, and partly the uselessness was the kind of infantilizing that everyone has to be treated on the same level. So instead of discussing books or writing, or it was like talk about brushing your teeth, or like it goes down to the very, very most basic level. So in the groups that Brian's in, it's he's with these patients who are really developmentally disabled. So it has to be at the kind of the most basic functional level, and so there's nothing that's therapeutic about it at all.
Nothing stimulating.
Right, there's nothing stimulating. Yeah,
and then you see he gets so frustrated after a period of time, he like tries to break out, and it kind of felt like to me like kind of reaching the breaking point again, like when the crime happened, like where it's just like there's no way out of this, I have to like break out, it felt like.
Yeah, and the problem is that Brian was well behaved and compliant, which is the term they always use for, or directable for the first few years, and then he realized that he was going to have to take medication, and that just destroyed him. And at one point he realized, well, anything, he wanted to die basically, and nothing could be worse than this. He wanted to try, and if he got shot by police and killed, that was better. If he got sent to prison, that was even better. So like that to me seems like an appropriate human reaction to that situation. And yet to the hospital, it's like his violence has reemerged, and it's like this pathological acting out. It's another resurfacing of his psychosis. Whereas to me, it seems like anyone would behave like that. I mean, it's just like a dog biting back when it's kicked. I mean, it seems to be a natural reaction, but if you have a history of violence, then there's nothing worse you can do than an act of violence because it's held against you. And that, his risk factor is always really high because it depends on things that happened in his childhood. Like, he had psychiatric treatment at an early age, he had a history of violence at an early age. Those things are never going to go away or change. So his risk factor is always going to be high. So it's really, he's really trapped. And yeah, I think that the waves of violence happen in the hospital the same way as they do in the family. I mean, it's really kind of just like the family on a larger level, and that tension, individual tension and ward tension develops to a certain point, and then violence breaks out, and then there's calm again, and it's really kind of an interesting insight into how institutions, social institutions work and fail to work, and the role of authority. And I mean, people sometimes have been asking me, like, what do you think? Why did you write this? What can we learn from this? What we can do? And I don't know. I don't have any answers. I just think I just wanted to tell Brian's story and to pay attention to individuals in this situation who just have no kind of outlet and no voice for themselves.
Yeah, it really raises awareness. And I think that was a really good point that you made throughout the book too. It's like he was very compliant and like calm for a long time, for years. And then it still wasn't seen as like progress because one, he didn't want to take medication. But it's like, why do you need medication if you're calm without it? And two, even when he was calm for a long time, all the psychiatrists and social workers would say that he was like good at tricking them into thinking that he wasn't psychotic when really he had all these psychotic processes happening underneath the surface.
Yeah, and that's just baffling to me, why they seemed so reluctant to grant him any kind of agency at all, or to say that maybe he's improved, or like he wanted to practice religion and that was a great help to him, but he learned that, you know, religiosity was a symptom of schizophrenia, and so he had to hide his religion and not practice it because that was seen as delusional, which is so messed up, really. And yeah, that any kind of improvement was seen. Psychiatrists were very reluctant to say, yes, he's improved, he seemed to be getting better. They all saw it as even more successful at hiding his psychosis. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, well, one reason is that he's smart, and he doesn't, like, he has dignity, and he kind of finds it difficult after a while to go along with these jump through hoops, and as would anyone. But also it seems that once you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, every new psychiatrist just copies down that diagnosis, and you're never cured of schizophrenia. You might be in remission for a while, but it might resurface. And even the patients who leave are told that it's kind of like diabetes. You have to take your medication. You have to make sure that there aren't recurring symptoms and be aware of things to look out for. But in Brian's case, it's like, because he was smart and because he was articulate and dignified, and because he had this diagnosis of schizophrenia, it was almost as though, like, the psychiatrist did, if they had said that he was getting better or said that he was making progress, then he would have foxed them, and they weren't going to allow for that. So they had to show that they saw through. It was almost like a kind of competition, of like who's going to win. And I really got the sense with some psychiatrists, just reading their reports, that that they had problems of their own, let's say.
Yeah, and another thing that I feel like, which you kind of allude to in this book, and I also have read kind of in other books that I've read, because I also like to read true crime and murder mysteries of all sorts, is that, sometimes, like with judges and lawyers and stuff, they don't want to be seen as the one that's light, or the one, they don't want to take responsibility. Like, what if something did happen and they saw him as a human being and they wanted to give him another chance, or like send him into a lighter kind of facility, or something like that. If something did happen down the line, they don't want to take responsibility for that possibility. So it's like everyone's kind of passing the buck and just sticking to this to like kind of avoid a responsibility.
And that's something that is really scary, actually. That, if when things go wrong in the hospital, when Brian he feels that he's not been given a chance of release, and he feels that the psychiatrists are unfair to him and that he ought to be released, eventually he gets the chance to go, like, what should be an external authority, to go to court and like to have a judge and jury decide, which should be taking the authority out of the hospital's hands and putting it into someone else's hands. And both times when that happens, he does a great job. He represents himself, And I included a lot of the elements of the transcripts I wanted to put across that, he really does a good job. He makes good arguments. He's coherent. He's rational. He knows what he's talking about. And even when the jury seemed to be in his favor, it's a hung jury both times, but the judge always decides against them and sends them back to the hospital. So the judiciary are really reluctant to go against psychiatrists' recommendations, which kind of begs the question, what's the point of having this going to court if you're just going to defer to the psychiatrist anyway? I mean, that's what he's trying to get away from, the psychiatrist having authority. So yeah, there's a failure to take responsibility. But then the judges are not just judging legal questions, that they're allowing the psychiatrist to have like moral and ethical authority over people, not just medical authority. And there's something else I want to say about that too, that was really this really bothers me about that. I can't remember, it will come back to me. But yeah, I mean, the legal system, I mean, the way that it intersects with the legal system is really disturbing too, that there's no outlook, even if you go outside of the hospital. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Even in Brian's trial, when he represented himself in court for a release hearing, like, he does really well. He seems articulate and intelligent, which he is. But the psychiatrists always say, there's something under the surface that you public can't see, but we trained psychiatrists know, and it doesn't manifest itself in his words, and it doesn't manifest itself in his actions, but it's this disturbed thought content that you have to be really an expert to know what's actually going on inside his head, and ordinary members of the public can't see it. And that's absurd, because it really puts psychiatrists, gives them this like mysticism. It makes psychiatry this kind of mystical activity that ordinary members of the public can't see, whereas in fact, most mental illness is very obvious, and there isn't some mysterious under the surface. If someone's thought content doesn't manifest itself in words and actions, then first of all, you don't know what it is, and secondly, so what? People can think about what they want as long as they're not breaking the law.
Right, exactly. No, yeah, I was really disturbed by that as well. And then, of course, it makes any outsider feel wary to go with what they're seeing, because they think, oh, is there something I'm not seeing because I'm not a trained expert, so it makes it really hard to get anyone on the person's side.
And I noticed the men in prison as well are very like frightened of like head shrinkers, because they feel like that these people can kind of see beneath the surface of their minds, and instead of seeing them ordinary flawed people. But the reason why there is that mysticism is because they have so much power, and they have power to to keep you in prison, or keep you in hospital, or send you to, they have power of life and death sometimes.
Yeah, it's just so opposite of the way I see people. Even as a psychologist, psychoanalyst, it's like, no, I'm learning from the person and what they're telling me and their thought process. This is like this idea of like judging and analyzing and labeling, and then I can't imagine like medicating people. It's just such a different mentality of how to treat people.
Yeah, and even the idea that like certain thoughts are dangerous or antisocial is very disturbing. And it's hard to know. I think Brian should be released. I don't think there's anything wrong with him. But there are plenty of people who've been released from psychiatric hospitals to commit further crimes, and so obviously people are very wary about failures. But is the alternative just to keep people medicated and locked up?
And so right now he's still in the same position where it's just kind of no end in sight.
Now, well, it's funny because he was recently sent to like a more lenient level where you can actually go out into the community with accompanied by a friend or family. But his sister lives in Ohio. She's the only contact he has, apart from me, and they won't let me take him. I'm banned from the hospital. So he can't leave the hospital. I talked to him yesterday and he said he'd been put on a discharge ward, which is like they'll, at least another year before he gets out, but at least he's actually been on a discharge ward before. So on the one hand, it sounds great. It sounds like he's, discharged, he's getting close to release. On the other hand, words in the hospital have very different meanings, and is part of the kind of torture for Brian that he gets so close to the finish line and then for no apparent reason is sent back to the beginning again. So it's very, very reluctant to get hopeful on his behalf. And I think that's the other thing that interested me a lot, was the way that language is used in the hospital, and the way that you've worked in forensic facilities and psychiatric hospitals. You know that the words take on a peculiar meaning of their own, and you have to kind of pick up the meaning of the most important word. And language is all important because it becomes a question of knowing the right word to say at the right time to the right person to secure your release. And words have a different meaning than they do outside of the hospital. And then too many schizophrenic patients, they get very trapped in language anyway, and language becomes this like system of a code that has its own implications. So there's like a trap on top of another trap to do with language. So what a discharge ward is, I'm not really sure, but it's probably not what we think of as a discharge ward.
Yeah, and it's a good point too, though. It's like people do have to learn kind of the right thing to say at the right time and how to behave, which is actually like you're basically wanting people to act in a certain way, perform in a certain way to get released. And if they can't do that, or they decide not to do that or play that game, then if they do want to just be honest, it's not going to work in their favor. So like, what are we teaching people to do exactly?
Yeah. When I was in hospital, I remember like the psychiatrist would ask me like, "Are you still depressed?" And I know the answer is obviously to get out. I would have to say no, I'm not depressed. But obviously, being in the hospital hasn't helped me get less depressed. So I have to say yes, I'm not. Or yes, I'm less depressed, which is a lie. But I also have to say it in a way that makes it seem as though I'm not faking it. So it's very difficult to say the right thing in the right way. And I think that a lot of people who are in Brian's situation and eventually get released may have a mental illness from the years of being in the hospital. I mean, I think it might induce a certain amount of paranoia. So if Brian does have a residual mental illness, I don't think it's paranoid schizophrenia. I think it's from years of incarceration, which will kind of mess with anyone's brain.
Right. Well, and also like, the diagnosis of schizophrenia like came from like years of trauma and abuse. So it's like, isn't this at the end of the day just like chronic trauma and abuse, that just manifests itself in these either paranoia or a florid psychotic episode or.
Yeah. And I also like reading true crime, but I often wish it were more nuanced and not always taking the point of view of the prosecution and the police and because real life is so much more interesting than that, actually. To see the victim and perpetrator as the same person, or the same versions of the same person, or different points on the same scale, it makes things more complicated and more interesting. I mean, it's difficult to tell that narrative because it's circular and it goes against like the narrative trajectory, but I'm much more interested in complex stories, even if they don't follow a usual trajectory. And I'd like to read more psychologically influenced true crime too.
Yeah, I would really love to. So, how many more books are you going to write? Hopefully many. What are your other books, your previous books, just so we can mention that? I want to make sure that I've read all of your books.
Well, um, the last one was An Unexplained Death, and the one before that was called The Maximum Security Book Club. And I'll mention I have a book called Phantoms of the Clinic, which is about psychoanalysis and the occult and the history of psychoanalysis and magic. And I think those are the only relevant ones. But you can get to my
I haven't
website.
read that one. I'm going to have to get that, and then we're going to
Oh,
have
you
to talk
haven't?
about it.
Oh, I can
No,
send you a copy.
I need to read that. I'm
Yeah, it
giving
came
a
out.
talk about Freud and the occult in September.
I'll send you a copy. It came out with Karnak, and it's about how what began as thought transference is now called projective identification, but it's missed. Like people don't know what it is, and Freud's work on fortune telling and telepathy, and which is the most interesting part of Freud, as far as I'm concerned. Dream work. Yeah, there's so much I would like to have got into with Brian about his past and his family and how that contributed to his mental illness, but the circumstances just don't allow for that. So much of the therapy in the hospital is about like symptom reduction and what's happening with the medication, and should we raise it or lower it? It's basically and daily functioning.
Right. There's no concern, it seems, about the interiority of the person, which is also doesn't make sense with what they're saying because, like you said, it's all about symptom reduction. But if someone's acting calm, then they're like hiding the psychosis. Which way is it?
Yeah, it's like there's a real suspicion about what's going on inside people that their behavior doesn't manifest. I mean, not just in the psychiatric system, but in culture generally, like people concealing that their language being deceptive, and it's almost as though like if it's not on the surface, it can't be trusted. We only trust what we can see and measure.
Mm-hmm. And this also the thing with it being parasite, like killing the parents. The family institution, the nuclear family is like so sacred, so sacred in the States. It feels like a really like Christian ethic. I guess it's everywhere, but it's like nobody can admit that maybe you have negative feelings about your parents, and maybe parents have negative feelings about their children. It's like people would have to start examining the ambivalence in the parent-child relationship if they could accept that this could happen, like the parent-child relationship to get to a point where there is parasite. But instead, it's just like with everything. I feel like they just go, "Oh, is this individual person is messed up? End of story." And then nobody wants to look at like the dynamics in that family or the dynamics in culture, like with every mass shooting, which is clearly like a total epidemic in the States. I read there was like 18 in 1 week last week. But it's like, what, like, are all these individuals just sick individuals, or is there something in the culture that is creating this problem?
Yeah, and I feel like if if we examine that, like if we had a more nuanced sense of parent-child relationships and talked openly about the fact that parents can hate their children, regret having children, and if that were more openly discussed, I think things would be healthier. But also, and this would be healthier, people wouldn't be so ready to have children. I think people would think a lot more carefully about having children and might decide not to. And I think that would be a really good thing. you know, like I think it's often a problem. Like the encourage people are just having children without really thinking about it. And I feel like if you really think about it, you don't do it because it doesn't make sense. But we don't talk about that either.
Yeah, I said that too. When I got to a certain age, I realized I was like, I think people have children before they realize that they could not have children.
Because if you like your body and your hormones and your relationship sort of fox you into it, and if you get beyond that phase and see things clearly, you realize like, oh yeah, it's just I'm not, I'm not going to do that. Like, it's just a myth. It's just a delusion, and yet people just keep on doing it.
Yeah, no, Carl asked me, we got married when I was 39, and Carl asked me, he's like, do you want to have a kid? And I had always been like, no, it's not for me, not for me. And I was like, okay, this is stable. There's good, like, social systems in Sweden. Like, it's got good education that's free. You know, like, if I was going to have one, this would be like an ideal thing to do it. And I was like, no, thank you. Like, actually, Carl's daughter had just like turned 18, you know? And I was like, you really want to start all over from the beginning?
Yeah.
Like, when we could just like hang out together and like travel and do other things. And he's like, yeah, that sounds nice. Yeah, let's just do that.
I had a hysterectomy a couple of years ago, and I remember thinking, like, after I had the hysterectomy, thinking, like, thank God, like, now it's definite. Now I definitely can't have it. Like, before that, I could always possibly get pregnant by accident, but now it's like definitely not. Thank goodness.
Done. Yeah, no, I'm relieved. I sometimes joke that I feel like I won the game of life by not having kids.
I never had any maternal feelings at all. I mean, I love my animals and my pets, but I've never liked children, actually.
No, I like other people's kids. I like hanging out with my friends' kids, and then I like giving them back and going home by myself.
The culture should have like a group of kids that they just like hand around occasionally for people to take in.
Should hang out with a kid.
Yeah, play games and then give them back.
And then by the end of the day, you'll be over it. Apologies to all those who have their children and love them, but that's how we feel. And I actually feel very happy. Like, you know, as a woman, it wasn't really an option for all of human history to not have kids. So I think about, like, my mom had me when she was 34, which was a little late for her time, and she had the one being me. And her mom died in childbirth. And then I think of like all the women before birth control that like basically just lived their entire lives from like the age of 14 on, you know, pregnant or have like having a kid, making a kid, taking care of kids, and did that from like, you know, their teens until their death, either from childbirth or, you know, they just got older or had a disease or something else. But it's like basically most of human history, all women have done is have kids. So I actually feel really like proud that I can like not do that and do something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's really radical, actually. And now that we're talking about it, I'm surprised there aren't more matricides. I'm surprised there are so few. You know, it's just like a breeding ground of anxiety and the family in general. So yeah, I think finding your own path is the best way.
Yeah, families are complicated and parents are complicated and kids are complicated. And actually, I also brought this because in the New York Review of Books recently, I don't know if you saw this, but they had an article called "Murder Is My Business" where they talk about true crime. And they said that like some of the early true crime was actually handed out at public executions in Britain in the 18th century. That's how it started. And they also described true crime as like the first first reality entertainment, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't like that article. I was just arguing about with it. It was, I mean, she has a kind of retro view of true crime, and I feel like there's a lot more interesting ways of looking at true crime than that. But there are like more and more kind of nuanced and interesting true crime books coming out.
I hope so. She also pointed out that like more women were reading true crime, but not necessarily writing it. It didn't seem like from the article.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it's more psychologically nuanced. Everything, really, not just true crime, but I just hope dialogue becomes more psychologically nuanced, period, which is basically why I started this podcast.
You know, something I've experienced is that like when I'm writing and if it's something is like too plausible and complicated, people aren't interested in it. Like it has to be sort of nicely shaped, and it's the same with true crime. Like it has to have this like editing, commentary, narrative art, and it can't be just a big mess, which is what it actually is, because that's hard to convey in a form of the culturally acceptable forms of narrative. So it's really hard to convey that mess and for people to be, to give it 5 stars on their podcast or whatever, and to fit into what we're expecting. So expectations have to change too, I think. Yeah, and maybe vehicles of delivery.
Yeah, and I think we also were talking about it before we started recording, but you said you were hoping, I told you how compelled I was reading this book. I read it in just a few days and I couldn't put it down. And you said you were glad to hear that, because a lot of what you're writing about is like this like treacherous, like bureaucratic kind of process that can get really like boring. But having worked in the hospital system, I really appreciated that I could tell, like, when you were pulling things from like files or interviews or something, you could really tell that you were writing from like the details of like what was happening in the hospital and in the courtroom and that sort of thing. And I really liked hearing all of that, and you wrote it in a really interesting and compelling way.
Good. I'm trying to like write books that sell and are popular, but also are interesting to write for me, and without like pandering or making things more palatable. So it's a tightrope, but I enjoy writing this, and I hope to write lots more.
Yeah, and so we'll link also to the previous time that you were on the podcast, and you talked about your last book, so that people can check that out too. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I'm really enjoying your show now, and your podcast, but I like watching too. I like seeing what people look like.
Yeah, I like seeing the conversations too, and a lot of people have said that they like that. That's why I started putting them together that way. It's nice. And if you haven't seen Ingo Lambrecht's yet, he talks about exactly that. Like, if you talk about projective identification, then it's okay. But if you talk about telepathy or thought transference, then it's like no.
Oh, I watched a bit of that. I'll have to finish it.
Yeah, he mentioned that. You would love him. You two would love each other. I'm gonna have to somehow, some future conference, somehow you two will have to be in the same room or a virtual room.
Yeah, I'll send you the book.
I would love that. Great. Well, we can stop there then.
All right. Well, it was nice to talk to you and see you.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Mikita Brottman. For more, please visit her website, MikitaBrottman.com. You can also check out her Twitter at BrottmanMikita and her Instagram at Mikita Brottman. That's MikitaBrottman. You can also listen to our previous discussion at Rendering Unconscious Podcast, episode number 27, with Mikita Brottman, author and psychoanalyst. Rendering Unconscious is also a book, Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry, available from Trapart Books, 2019. For more, please visit our publisher's website, trapart.net. That's TRAPART.net. For more information, you can visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net, and sign up for my newsletter on the contact page to stay abreast of all upcoming events. You can also visit the Rendering Unconscious main website, renderingunconscious.org. And follow me at Instagram and Twitter at rawsin_. That's RAWSIN_. Thank you so much for listening to Rendering Unconscious Podcast and for your support. You can support the podcast at our Patreon. That's patreon.com/Vanessa23Carl. Your support is so appreciated. Thank you so much to all of our Patreon patrons. And now, another big storm tonight. From the album, The Pathways of the Heart, for Jess, available at Bandcamp. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Another big storm tonight. Yourself. The ego itself is a symptom, and you didn't know where the hell that had come from a minute ago. But she kind of suspected there was an unmistakable rosy red flush by a megalomaniac consume Dracula's powdered gag, but she didn't want to draw too much attention to herself. She, about Ben's last days, and to enjoy cocoa and a platter of ices, have sent it as a punishment because the victim, events of life and the world take place in himself. Yet if he reflects, and I can tell you that there is a sweetness in that. The twigs of the cedar tree would be brought to land, planted like a willow by abundant water, would told me, and so I collected the branches and bundled. Caves of Sorcerers, the American Beginnings. Identification may also easily tempt the analyst to take the mothers, that exteroceptive, proprioceptive, and interoceptive sensations. Intellectuals, the literary avant-garde and book shunning, and nature as such as the perfect allegorical platform, experienced and are relieved when fuller integration is achieved. Complete and permanent integration is, in my view, never possible. The deeper and more complex the difficulties we are analyzing, the two of the Norwegian guys sit with us while another pair takes seats at. Smoke like red blood rising into the heavens, and they knew. And sleepy, soulful eyes, he is draped with beautiful, richly covered fabrics. Time, in such recent history of their, it were to your, we are quite yet, and how much, even thus young, then has found effect as a creature upon the unparalleled peril of consciousness, destroys that alone would berate him, cities, his state, his laws, his inmost soul. We are nearer now. The dead to admire the seams of the nation shining with fossilized carbons, while the living configure secret, myself falling into a kind of hypnotic state, my eyes halfway closed, the writings of Melanie Klein, the birth of tragedy, visual arts. Do you have a term for poetry inspired by music? Claim that there aren't really any new. Is the assiduous veiling during the performance of the tragedy of the intrinsically Dionysian effect, which, however, is so powerful that it place and give in to the urge immediately to alleviate his child's don't, she replied. I leave that to you, Black, but I've never really seen anything like it. If the dioramas of cinematic expectation in the half-dark, when we are asleep, we oftentimes have one eye open and are able to. Some of the less popular or prominent pieces, how the hell do you explain? Consisting of an odd texture, or consisting and consumption of human meat, seems to have been this occasional casualness in the matter of the identification with a fantasy of what we imagine ourselves and or mothers to perceive. We pass through the doorway, we dispose of our shoes, and find that the scene, together with the action, was fundamentally and thought of as only as a vision, that the only reality is just then why couldn't we choose to adjust that experience, those which of itself generates the vision and celebrates it with the symbolism of dancing, music, and speech. In the vision, this belongs to one of those charred bodies and was close to those fires, must live into a future without illusion, especially the